I saw the Emperor, this world soul, riding out of the city. It is indeed a wonderful sensation to see such an individual who, concentrated here at a single point, astride a horse, reaches out over the world and masters it. These words were written by the German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel to his friend Niethammer in 1806, after Hegel had seen, indeed, Napoleon take Jena and ride through the city. The passage from this letter has been popularized and a bit misquoted as Hegel referring to Napoleon as the world spirit on a horse's back. Now, in the following, I want to consider what it is that Hegel means by world spirit, world soul, by spirit, and by the philosophy of history, but also by the so-called end of history, which I can say right now is also a bit of a misquote or misuse of Hegel by Alexandre Kojève. And moreover, I want to look at world individuals, or individuals that are of world historical importance today, of which I can name two, Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron. I will suggest, moreover, that these two politicians are, in fact, the perfect adversaries, and that they should be, so that Europe and America become adversarial again. In fact, post-liberal in their relationship, so that through a friendly and healthy adversary relationship, Europe can regain its senses and sharpen itself, re-enter history again. So let me begin by quoting Emmanuel Macron himself on his understanding of Hegel and history and the great individual, which we find in an interview with him in Der Spiegel, the German news magazine, from 2017. Before I quote from that, though, let me point out that Macron, during his initial election campaign in 2016-17, developed the notion of him as a Jupiterian leader. So Macron does tie himself to ancient Rome, to Jupiter, to the god of the sky, who rules absolutely by his decree. In his interview with the Spiegel, Macron points out that we need to develop political heroism, that we need to become heroic again in politics. Now, mind you that this is post-2016, and 2016 was the year in which Brexit happened and Trump. Both events, as minor as they actually should be, were a shock to the liberal consensus of post-1945, but especially post the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union. So it was, in fact, an affront to the chattering classes in the world cities in the West who believed that the end of history in liberal democracy had actually occurred. And the specific end of history, which is misattributed to Hegel by way of Francis Fukuyama and Alexandre Kojève. Now, Francis Fukuyama's book, by the way, The End of History, bears the telling subtitle, The End of History, subtitle, and The Last Man. I'll just leave it at that. But Macron, it seems, had already seen in 2017, post-2016, that it is time again for bold political vision that goes well beyond just a social market democracy or a welfare state promise. Macron's interview with Der Spiegel begins with the question whether Macron believes that one single individual can, in fact, steer history. Now here, Der Spiegel, by the way, also misquotes Hegel and says that Hegel once described Napoleon Bonaparte as der Weltgeist, world spirit on horseback. Now, as you know now, Hegel never really said that. And also the question is a bit misleading because the question implies, as Macron will point out, that Hegel believed that a single person, a great individual, can steer history on his own. Now, Hegel does not believe that. And here is Macron's response. No, Hegel viewed the great men as instruments of something far greater. It should be said that in referring to him in that way, he wasn't being particularly nice to Napoleon, because he, of course, knows that history can always outflank you, that it is always larger than the individual. Hegel believes that an individual can indeed embody the zeitgeist for a moment, or I should say the world spirit, really, but also that the individual isn't always clear they are doing so. So when we speak of the great historical or world historical individuals, and for example of Trump or Macron in this manner, then there's no suggestion here that these individuals steer history on their own. They're steering something that is already, to put it simply, already in the air. Now, let's use for a second here this misquote from Hegel. Let's just pretend that he actually speaks of the Weltgeist, of world spirit on horse's back. Now, this would mean, now, Weltgeist, Hegel describes in Geschichte, in history, is actually spirit. Now, that's to say that Worldgeist is particularized, fully actualized, concretized spirit, even though, of course, spirit is itself the most concrete, but world spirit is a finite revelation of it, or a finite instantiation of it, so that the one who is world spirit at this one point is indeed in touch with history as a totality. That's to say, with the idea itself, in which there is no past, no present, no future. There's just the idea. There is spirit, pure spirit, and that is again to say they are in touch with, yes, with which has been, but in such a way that everything in them comes alive. They embody in a concrete manner that which currently is, but that which currently plays out historically is inextricably for Hegel part of the ultimately, not, I wouldn't say rational process, but the process of history that is of reason. So reason doesn't underlie history, but history will show itself to be rational or reasonable. And that's not to suggest that everything that happens is perfectly marching towards ever greater progress or freedom. Hegel does say that history is a slaughter bench. This is to suggest something else. It's to suggest that even though there are different perspectives, because experience is not immediate, and certain categories are universal, but other categories are not universal. They need to be made explicit, and different civilizations and cultures are on different levels here. Now, despite all this, there can be the standpoint, having arrived at absolute knowledge, and as Hegel says in the introduction to his philosophy of Weltgeschichte, that he has seen the whole, hat das Ganze gesehen. I'll look for it now. Weil mir bereits das Ganze bekannt ist, because to me already the whole or the totality is known. That's not to say that he knows everything, but that the absolute standpoint, which is absolute, that's to say, separate from the rest, but at the same time immanently containing everything that is. In this manner, then, history can be seen as reasonable because we can see that there is something at stake in history, and that is freedom. The reason that we can see this, that's what it means to suggest that history is rational. That's not to say that everything that happens is perfect and wonderful and how you'd like to see it. It will remain conflictual. And that, of course, has to do with the fact also that history is itself a dialectical process. Now, history as dialectics is not at all in the Hegelian sense thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. That's wrong. That's misguided Hegelian understanding. It's a lot more complex. And without going too deep into this, it's to say that concepts inherently are contradicting themselves, as it were, and also sublating themselves. So for example, in our time, we speak of freedom in the West, but we now have for the most part, a neoliberal understanding of freedom, as first a liberal understanding of freedom, and then a neoliberal understanding of freedom, in which freedom is entirely subsumed by market forces. So here we can see that it's to a certain degree, yes, it's a corruption of freedom, but it's inherent in the concept itself. The concept works itself out in history, and that is ultimately also what is meant by by history being of reason, being, in that sense, rational. We can actually understand it, we can see where something falls off of what it's supposed to be, and then return to it, sublate it, lift it higher, fall back out of it again. So there are genuine setbacks even in Hegel. So to suggest, as Francis Fukuyama has done following the mistranslation by Alexandre Kojève of Hegel, that there is an end of history, which was the paradigm after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union in the West, this suggestion was itself, one could say, perhaps, well, misguided, yes, a misunderstanding of Hegel, yes, but it was a paradigm by which all institutions function. At the same time, one might perhaps also want to point out that the very paradigm and concept of the end of history as it was propagated in the West after the publication by Fukuyama's book through the media and academia, etc., functioned, and this very concept functioned as a PR term and, as it were, as a bit of a smokescreen as well, to conceal the true workings of power. But I shall leave it at that for now. Now, Alexandre Kojève translated Hegel and mistranslated Hegel quite a bit. He mistranslated, for example, the important notion of Endzweck. Now, Hegel does speak, right at the beginning of his Philosophie der Weltgeschichte, Philosophy of World History, of the Endzweck der Welt. That's not the final cause of the world, but rather the final end of the world. Yeah, but not end in terms of Ende, as in the sense of where something is coming to an end, but as you have it, for example, in the saying, the end justified the means, etc. Not that Hegel would think like that at all, but I just want to illustrate what the word end here is supposed to mean. So there is an Endzweck der Welt, not a final cause, and I'll talk more about cause in a second, but there is an Endzweck, a final end of the world. There's something the world strives to and comes back from. So we could also use the Aristotelian term, of course, which is telos. There's an ultimate telos that the world has, and that is reason itself. Reason is that which gives everything its worthiness, as Hegel says. But this is not the reason, as he points out also, this is not the reason of some individual. It's not subjective reason. This is, as he says, is divine reason. There is hence in history proper nothing actually contingent when it comes to what it is that we discern from history, what it is that we do in history. Yes, there is contingency everywhere, all the time, but what is truly at stake in history is not the contingent. The world of willing is the world of reason, and that is the world that matters for history. There can be earthquakes, and they have ramifications for human history. That's true for how human beings dwell, etc. And the earthquake of Lisbon, for example, triggered an incredible philosophical debate. But we are talking here about human activity, and in human activity we must presuppose freedom as well as free agency, or else it's pointless to even talk about history in a proper sense. Simply listing contingency after contingency, as very often, by the way, the French genealogical school does, leads us nowhere. You could find one genealogy after another for certain phenomena such as madness in society, but that doesn't mean that anything that you say is valid. We need to get to what is logically valid. So the mistranslation by Kougev of Hegel has had tremendous impact on world history, ironically enough. It was the mistranslation of das Endzweck, the Endzweck der Welt, the final telos of the world from which the world actually begins, which is reason itself. Without reason, there's no world to discern, to even make sense of. This mistranslation has had such a tremendous impact that we began to think in the West in terms of liberal democracy winning out this perfectly superficial dialectical battle between communism and capitalism. You can see the superficial antithetical dialectic at play here, which is not Hegel's dialectic at all. And after the assumed victory of the West, hence of capitalist liberal democracy, which pretends that Italy's democracy is the same as Germany's democracy, is the same as France, is the same as Spain's, is the same as Britain's, is the same as Sweden's, is the same as the United States of America, etc., etc. That is simply not the case. Macron, by the way, is very aware of this, and you should perhaps read his interview in Der Spiegel from 2017, which is in English, so that you can also discern for yourself that Macron is actually capable of understanding that even just Germany and France, the two founding nations of the European Union, really together with Italy, are vastly different, even just in terms of religion, especially, given that Germany is, for the most part, Protestant. In any event, 2016 depicted, and Macron saw this, the end of history, which is to say, the end of the liberal self-understanding and self-determination after the fall of the Soviet Union. And now we have to consider where we are in the 21st century. The long 20th century is not yet over. Trump is very clearly a retrograde candidate. Now, considering where we are, and after all, you are watching this video here on YouTube, we live in the age of social media, of the simulation, to use the Baudrillardian term by Baudrillard, Baudrillardian term. We live in the age of the simulacrum, and in the age, hence, of projection. And I don't mean in a psychological manner so much, but really of projection, where someone like Trump has perfected the art of being a screen. And hence, Trump can be so many things to so many people. He can be the Antichrist. He can literally be the worst Austrian who ever lived. He can be a Russian spy. He can be anything that people want to see in him. Trump is the biggest living, breathing screen that has ever existed. In some sense, he's properly a simulacrum. And still, the Trump phenomenon does something quite striking. It shows that what was, by the way, left-wing consensus in the early 2000s, that there is post-democracy, that post-democracy is now no longer even an issue, neither to the left nor to the right. The fact that in 2016, after the election of Trump and after Brexit, the liberal consensus could only respond in a very reactionary manner, by the way, by screaming about the post-truth world or the post-factual world. Well, now with Hegel again, There are facts, yes, but those facts are always also up for perspective. There is no immediate experience. Categories change over time, and what hence the philosophy of world history must contribute is to find that which is genuinely necessary. So we must see why, and this goes beyond the scope of what I'm trying to do here, we must be able to see why reason unfolds in the manner it does now, given the media landscape in which we are. You see, that is what we have to understand, what we have to grasp at, rather than freaking out over certain liberal proclivities that we might have. So now that the end of history has occurred, liberal consensus is over, there seems to be no good answer. There's the talk of post-liberalism, etc. Anything that has to announce itself as post or as new is about as new as yesterday's news. That also shows a certain embarrassment that we cannot yet envision something greater. Now, I think with Macron, there is at least someone who has potential to be extremely visionary. And he has said in direct response to Trump's new election victory now in 2024 that Europe must assert itself, must assert itself and its own interests on the world stage, or else, and this is now what I have to say, if Europe does not do this, then Europe will become the world's Disneyland. Europe will be reduced to a museum with our beautiful cities turned into fun parks or amusement parks for tourists from all over the world. And we'll be happy if we can sweep the floors. So, this moment is a call for Europe, or calls upon Europe to re-enter history, to take that seriously, to take itself seriously again in this manner, and to awaken from the stupor of what was pulled over our eyes with the notion of the end of history.